I know that the vast majority of you out there are probably already familiar with the Iceberg template, but since this is a very niche topic, and there might be some viewers who are much older than us Gen Zers, I'll go ahead and take a minute to explain it. Basically, an iceberg format video is a way of showing how deep a subject goes. As it moves lower, it shows the stuff that's more obscure and usually more cryptic. Just like an iceberg, you can see the tip, and then it moves lower. Also, just in case some of you don't know what the difference between Catholicism and traditional Catholicism is, basically, a traditional Catholic, or a trad for short, is a Catholic who believes that we should be more traditional. The movement started in the 1960s when things in the church started getting weird, to say the least. Trads such as myself think that the more the church embraces the spirit of the age, the worse things will get. So the solution is to return to tradition. The traditionalist mentality comes in different shapes and sizes, and that's largely what we'll be covering as we move through the different levels. Also, I just want to say up front that even though most of these topics are very controversial and there's a lot of different opinions on them, I will be presenting the traditional Catholic perspective. I also will not be covering the Society of St. Pius X. It's a very nuanced topic, and to accurately depict the history, the mentality, and the arguments for and against it, it would take far too long for an iceberg entry. And honestly, I don't feel qualified to talk about the SSPX, and I want to avoid misrepresenting anyone, so I think it would be better to just not address it. And with all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump right into the traditional Catholicism iceberg.
En Little Caesars descubrimos que lo increíble.
So starting with the first level, this is stuff that's very common knowledge among traditional Catholics. I didn't include much here because I want to save time for the more interesting topics listed lower, so I'll be pretty brief with addressing them. Also, quick side note, for generic B-roll footage, I'll be using old public domain religious movies, even if they don't fit the topic 100%. It was between that and Family Guy clips with iPhone games underneath. So let's go ahead and get into our first entry then. EWTN stands for Eternal World Television Network. It's a Catholic television station that produces lots of Catholic content, news, and various other forms of media. They do a lot of great work. The reason I put them so high on the iceberg is because they're really normie compared to the stuff that's later on the list. In fact, I can't even imagine them mentioning half the stuff that's in tiers 3 and 4. Fatima is a small town in Portugal. In the year 1917, 3 shepherd children saw the Virgin Mary appear to them over a series of visions lasting several months. The visions ended when the children had predicted that a miracle was going to happen upon the Virgin's next scheduled visit. Tens of thousands of people gathered to see what would happen. The sun began spiraling and moving back and forth towards the earth, changing colors as it did so. The ground, which had been soaked from the heavy rainfall that day, was completely dried, and so were people's clothes who were there. Thousands of people converted. Even secular atheist news publications reported the miracle of the sun. Eucharistic miracles are whenever the Eucharist, which Catholics understand to be Jesus' true body, does something out of the ordinary, or miraculous. Some of these include the host bleeding and it turning into physical human flesh in the priest's hands. These occurrences are very rare, but they're fascinating to read about. Apostolic succession refers to the concept that all bishops alive today can trace their ecclesial lineage back to the 12 apostles. What that means is that every bishop was consecrated by another bishop, and that bishop had to be consecrated by another bishop, and him by another, and on and on and on, all the way back to the 12 apostles. While most bishops aren't able to show strict documentation of their succession back to the apostles, the Pope is actually able to do so. We have a complete list of popes all the way from Peter to Francis. If you grew up Catholic or go to a Catholic parish, statistically you're almost guaranteed to end up in a Latin Rite church. This is the most common rite by far, but there are actually 24 rites in total in the Catholic Church. These rites look very different from the typical Latin rites. They have a different liturgy and sometimes even a different hierarchy, but they're still in communion with the one universal church under the Pope. In a lot of these cases, they look incredibly similar to Eastern Orthodox churches, with the difference being that the Orthodox churches have some theological variations and they don't accept the Pope.
En el mundo digital, la seguridad de los datos es fundamental.
Recientemente,
The traditional Latin Mass is one of the cornerstones of traditional Catholicism, and it's currently under furious attack. The traditional Latin Mass, or TLM for short, is the liturgy used by the Latin Rite of the Church from the 1500s until the 1960s. And it's far more beautiful, far more sacred, and far more reverent than the new Mass, or Novus Ordo as it's called, that was introduced in the 60s. Chant is used, everything is said in Latin, and the priest faces away from the congregation and speaks in a very low voice. There's lots of silence, and it's overall an amazing experience. However, many of the clergy in Rome don't like this Mass at all, and are launching an all-out assault against it. Pope Francis himself has released several documents attempting to restrict its use as much as he can, and there's rumors that he's going to release yet another document restricting it even more in the very near future. From a traditional Catholic perspective, it all boils down to this. The new Mass is a bad liturgy produced by 1960s clergy who wanted to try a strange, avant-garde experiment, and now they're upset that the experiment has failed and everyone prefers the old Mass. The restrictions of the TLM are simply a means of damage control. They're hoping that if they can phase out the TLM permanently, which they openly state they want to do, then everyone will just have to accept their new 1960s Mass. Taylor Marshall is a YouTuber and podcaster who makes a lot of traditional Catholic content. He was a big influence on me when I first started attending college. Many more moderate Catholics don't like him at all because he's very traditional and sometimes gets a little scrappy when talking about the clergy.
Don't be coming to me as a lispy little Jesuit.
In 2019, he wrote a book called Infiltration, where he goes over the history of the Freemasons and Communists and their plan to infiltrate the Catholic Church. He goes over all the names, places and events, and talks about how they've largely succeeded in their goals. But in terms of traditional Catholic news, podcasts, and videos, Taylor Marshall is at the top, easily. The Douay Rheims Bible is an English translation of the Bible produced by the Catholic Church before the King James Version. The New Testament was released in 1582 in Rheims, and the Old Testament was released in 1609 by the University of Douay. It was updated in 1777 because the English was a little hard to read by that point. The Douay Rheims is used almost exclusively by traditional Catholics because of its archaic language. Plus, it was translated using the Latin Vulgate as a source, which is the official Bible of the Latin Rite Church. Almost all other English translations of the Bible have some sort of baggage. Most of them are not done by Catholics. They're done by a giant group of scholars of all different backgrounds. So you're not reading a Bible made by Catholics for Catholics. You're reading a Bible made by Baptists, Methodists, Atheists, Jews, Agnostics, and maybe a couple Catholics in there. The Douay Rheims is so popular among trads because it's one of the only English Bibles made for Catholics by Catholics. Oh boy, this is a big one. Vatican II was a church council in the 1960s which tried to address what they thought were the big issues of the time. Mostly how to get lay people to participate in the church, how the church would interact with other religions, things like that. After the council concluded, things went crazy in the church. The new mass was released and priests did pretty much every strange variation you can imagine. I'll let this famous clip explain.
The world has seen clown masses in which the, quote, priest dresses as a clown in utter mockery of God. The world has seen priests dress as Dracula in football jerseys accompanied by cheerleaders, as a cheesehead. There have been disco masses, gymnastic performances during the new mass, balloon masses, carnival masses, nude masses, at which scantily clad or nude people take part, and we have seen juggling masses at which a juggler performs during the new mass. The world has seen priests celebrate the new mass with Dorito chips, with Mountain Dew, on a cardboard box with cookies, with Chinese tea accompanied by ancestor worship, with a basketball as a priest bounces it all over the altar, with a guitar as the priest plays a solo performance. The world has witnessed the new mass with a priest almost totally nude as he dances around the altar, with priests dressed in native pagan costumes, with a Jewish menorah placed on the altar, with a statue of Buddha on the altar, with nuns making offerings to female goddesses, with lectors and gift bearers dressed up as voodoo Satanists. The world has seen the new mass at which the performer is dressed up in a tuxedo and tells jokes. The world has seen rock concerts at the new mass, guitar and polka new masses, a puppet new mass, a new mass where the people gather around the altar dressed as devils, a new mass where people perform lewd dances to the beat of a steel drum band. The world has seen a new mass where nuns dressed as pagan Vestal virgins make pagan offerings. The world has also seen new masses incorporating every false religion. There have been Buddhist new masses, Hindu and Muslim new masses where Jews and Unitarians offer candles to false gods. There are churches where the entire congregation says the Mass with the priest, where the priest sometimes talks to the people instead of saying Mass. What we have cataloged is just a tiny sampling of the kind of thing that occurs in every diocese in the world where the new Mass is celebrated, to one degree or another.
The peak of it was the clown masses, and yeah, there were several of them. It's the symbol of the goofy masses that have happened since the 1960s. Modernist Catholics want to just move on and pretend it was just an isolated thing and nothing like that has ever happened since. And true, we don't have clown masses anymore, but come on, the Novus Ordo is still giving us some pretty ridiculous masses.
Look, everybody wanna go and talk it. At the same time, gotta walk it.
The proper way to receive communion is on the tongue. This is what the church still teaches, even in 2023. So there's the obvious question, why is everyone getting the most holy and sacred Eucharist put directly into their hands like a kindergarten teacher is handing them a cookie? Well, basically, the church has given an indult for communion in the hand. For those of you who don't know, an indult is a temporary permission to do something that otherwise is not allowed. Several parishes around the world started distributing communion in the hand, and the church gave them this indult to smooth things over. It had the opposite effect that they intended. Now, nearly 100% of Catholics receive communion in the hand. You're the odd one out if you don't follow the rules. And I have several personal anecdotes of people going through RCIA classes or just general First Communion classes and being told the proper way to receive is in the hand. It's ridiculous by this point. This is another controversial one. Basically, the Bible says that women have to cover their heads in church, or just be bald. 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verses 4 through 6. Every man praying or prophesying with his head covered disgraceth his head. But every woman praying or prophesying with her head not covered disgraceth her head. For it is all one as if she were shaven. For if a woman not be covered, let her be shorn. But if it be a shame for a woman to be shorn or made bald, let her head be covered. But in the 1970s, the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith came along and said that women don't have to cover their heads if they don't want to. Now, I'll be honest, guys. I don't know exactly what weight of infallibility the CDF has or how binding this is on people, but it comes down to this. Which one are you going to listen to? A random group of 70s clergy who want nothing more than to modernize the church as much as they can, or Scripture itself along with thousands of years of tradition? A lot of people might say, yeah, if a woman wants to wear a veil, that's fine, but why do you have to try to push it on other people? First of all, it's not the traditionalists who are pushing it on other people, it's St. Paul. Second, this has gotten so bad that one time my wife, back when we were just dating, wore a veil to confession, and a priest actually scolded her for it. He straight up said she shouldn't wear it, and she was wrong for doing so. So it seems like the pendulum has swung way too far in the other direction. All this to say, ladies, wear a veil to church. Guys will be lining up around the block, and you'll be following the clear instructions of Scripture. Oh boy, the Jesuits. There's a lot I could say about these guys, but I'll keep it pretty brief because I don't want to get too far off track. Basically, the Jesuits are a religious order in the church. They were started by St. Ignatius of Loyola, who is absolutely amazing. The order produced countless holy priests and saints, but then around the 1960s, are you starting to notice a pattern? It went completely off the rails and was filled with every sort of modernism imaginable. If you see a priest with all-around terrible opinions, they're most likely a Jesuit. The ones pushing for religious indifferentism, radically new understandings of doctrines, universalism, it's always the Jesuits. To give a personal anecdote, I actually went to a Jesuit school in 8th grade. It was the University of Detroit. They taught us the usual garbage that you'd see in a conventional school, but they could get away with a lot more because they were allowed to talk about religion. One day, in language arts, they had us recite a Buddhist prayer in unison. I went home and mentioned it to my parents because I thought it was really stupid. I didn't know this until several years later, but my dad actually had an entire altercation with the school via email about it. They refused to tell him which Buddhist prayer it was. I'll be making a video about this incident soon, and I'll go through every single one of the emails that was sent. Most people think there are 4 sets of mysteries in the Rosary: the joyful, the sorrowful, the glorious, and the luminous. But a lot of us younger Catholics don't know that the luminous mysteries weren't a part of the Rosary until very recently, like our lifetime. They were added in 2002, so 21 years ago. But, of course, new isn't always bad. The reason traditionalists say that the luminous mysteries don't count is because they don't really fit with the rest of the Rosary. See, the official title of the Rosary is the Psalter of Our Lady. The reason it's called this is because it's supposed to match the Book of Psalms, which is called the Psalter of the Church. Our Lady's Psalter is supposed to match the Book of Psalms in this sense. 1 Hail Mary for every psalm. There's 150 psalms, 150 Hail Marys in the Rosary with all 3 mysteries. Plus, even though John Paul II was the Pope, we have to remember that it was Mary herself who gave us the Rosary. And she gave us 3 sets of mysteries, not 4. And while the Glory Be was added later, this is simply a small addition for meditating on the mysteries that are already there. It's not an entirely new set of mysteries. Overall, I think most trads would agree that the luminous mysteries are not inherently bad because the Rosary is a private devotion, and therefore you can be a little bit more creative with it than you can with other things like the Mass. But it shouldn't be called officially a part of the Rosary, since it completely takes away the symbolism of 150 Hail Marys, and it was not given to us by heaven. The third secret of Fatima. This is another huge one. The third secret could be its own iceberg because of how much information there is, so I'll keep it to the very brief spark notes. Please take more time to research this because it's a vital topic with lots of stuff that I have to leave out. Basically, if you remember Fatima from Tier 1, there was a series of messages given throughout the apparition. One of these messages was a set of 3 secrets. The first one was a vision of hell. The second one was a warning to do penance. This was during World War I, and there was a prediction that a second war would come, which would be even worse than the first one if the world didn't do penance. And the third secret is complicated. It was supposed to be concealed until 1960 or the death of Sister Lucia, who was one of the 3 children who saw the apparition. Once 1960 came, the church just straight up said they weren't going to release it because it wasn't the right time. Eventually, they did release it. What they released was a cryptic writing of a pope walking through a wasteland of dead bodies before he was eventually killed. There were a lot of problems with what they released. Firstly, the other 2 secrets had 2 parts, the vision and then the explanation. Mary would show them a vision and then explain what it means. But the third secret, which was easily the most mysterious of the 3, had no explanation given by Mary. Plus, the Vatican even admitted in the 60s that there were words. They said, "The Church does not desire to take the responsibility of guaranteeing the veracity of the words the 3 shepherd children said the Virgin Mary had addressed to them." This is a nonsensical thing for them to say, considering the version they released had no words from Mary in it. In addition, there are a couple people who have read the third secret before it was released, and all of them say that it was about an apostasy in the faith. They don't say it's a cryptic vision with absolutely no explanation. Again, I highly recommend you research this more. I'm only going over the basics of the basics. If you want to know a good place to start, I'll link Timothy Gordon's podcast about it in the description. Having a background in law, he knows how to present information like this incredibly well. Modern theologians are wrong about pretty much everything. This view is the result of comparing theological writings from the modern age with pretty much any other era in church history. Old school theology is very precise, very clear, and very rigid, to appropriate a pejorative. But if you read modern theological writings, it's all strange, avant-garde, and it's all just really if you dig deep into the conversations being had by today's theologians, they say some wacky things. Things like, Jesus didn't know he was God, limbo isn't actually real, the church abandoned it, we have no idea who wrote the Gospels, contraception is actually okay in some cases. It's things like, Jesus didn't know he was God, limbo isn't actually real, the church abandoned it. We have no idea who wrote the Gospels. Contraception is actually okay in some cases. It's this kind of stuff, and it's actually pretty prevalent if you dig deep. I should know, I currently attend a Catholic university. Point being, from a traditional Catholic perspective, if you want to learn theology, throw out everything modern and just stick to the great saints and doctors of the church that have stood the test of time. This is another one that I'm only going to address the basics of. I plan on making a whole video on this topic eventually. But basically, the Shroud of Turin is the burial cloth of Jesus. It has his image imprinted on it, so we know exactly what Jesus looked like. What's even more shocking is that when the first photograph of it was taken, it showed that the image on the cloth was actually a negative image. So reversing the image on the cloth into a negative photograph actually makes the details much clearer, giving us this image. Now, there was a large scientific study of the shroud done by a team of researchers in the 70s and 80s. They found several odd things about it. Things like there being no paint or scorch marks on the fabric. There's nothing on top of the fibers of the fabric putting the image on it. It's just kind of there. And there's a whole host of other weird and unexplainable things about the shroud. Well, it was shown through carbon dating that it actually came from the 13th or 14th century. So that's it, right? Us Catholics took the L on this one? Well, actually no. See, Ray Rogers, the leading chemist on this project, who was an atheist at the time, heard the theory that there was cotton in the sample they had tested, which would have been a later introduction to the material, making the test invalid. Ray Rogers had thought this theory was ridiculous and he wanted to disprove it. He was the only person in the world left with a sample from the carbon dating itself. He put it under a microscope and discovered there was cotton. So the test must have been invalid and the cotton was throwing off the carbon dating. Wikipedia makes no mention of this happening in the page about the Shroud of Turin. Extra ecclesiam nulla salus is a Latin phrase which translates into English as outside the church there is no salvation. This is a dogma of the faith. Of course, there are a lot of modern theologians who have tried to radically reinterpret this to mean that basically every single person is in the church in some way, but this is not letting the dogma speak for itself. Imagine for a moment if people tried to treat other dogmas this way. Imagine if they interpreted the dogma of the Immaculate Conception in such a way that Mary actually did have original sin. It would be ludicrous and a complete denial of the dogma. There have been many theologians, even in the past, who have said that those who have no knowledge of Jesus and no way of coming to know him might be saved if they do their best to act in accordance with natural law. And people take this conclusion and they say that every single person who doesn't have a complete knowledge of Jesus and a perfect knowledge of all points of doctrine must be invincibly ignorant. Really, extra ecclesiam nulla salus is kind of like a placement test for trads. How you interpret it determines where you are on the trad pipeline, and we'll address this more as we go on. Oh boy, this is going to be a fun one. Sedevacantism is the idea that the last 6 popes, that being John the 23rd, Paul the 6th, John Paul the 1st, John Paul the 2nd, Benedict the 16th, and Francis, are all anti-popes. An anti-pope, for those of you who don't know, is someone who claims to be the pope but is not. They also say that Vatican II, the council mentioned in Tier 2, was a false council and has no bearing on the Catholic faithful. The basic idea is that the last 6 popes were heretics. Heretics are, by divine law, outside the church. Since they are heretics, and heretics are outside the church, then there's no way they can be valid popes because those who are outside the church can't hold office inside the church. There are other versions of Sedevacantism and other premises that lead to the conclusion that the last 6 popes, also called the Vatican II popes for short, are anti-popes. But this version of Sedevacantism seems to be the most popular. Just to be clear, I am not a Sedevacantist. And it's not because I think it's completely impossible. I just haven't heard any arguments that make me absolutely certain it's true. And if I'm going to say that the last 6 popes have all been invalid, I'm going to have to be completely certain. In addition, there are some other views that go along with Sedevacantism. For example, the new Mass that was promulgated after Vatican II, which is the Mass that you see in basically every parish in the world, is completely invalid in their view. Also, the ordination of nearly every priest and the consecration of nearly every bishop is also invalid in their view. Most Sedevacantists think that there are only a tiny number of priests and bishops left in the world, and there's even a subsection within Sedevacantists that think there are no bishops left, which brings us right into our next topic. VaticanCatholic.com is a Sedevacantist website and YouTube channel. They're like ultra Sedevacantists. As mentioned earlier, they believe that not only the Vatican II popes are invalid, but also every bishop in the world. The channel is managed by 2 brothers, Brother Peter Diamond and Brother Michael Diamond, and they're honestly really interesting. Here's a list of some of their more notable ideas. 1. Every single person without baptism goes to hell, even if they're in the process of being brought into the church when they die and they have an explicit intention to be baptized. 2. If you yourself don't believe the aforementioned belief on baptism, then you're also going to hell. 3. Stage magicians use real demonic magic on stage. 4. Pope John Paul II is the Antichrist. 5. Catholics cannot pray for non-Catholics who die. 6. Natural family planning is a form of contraception. And 7. Mother Teresa was a notorious heretic and a sinner, and definitely not a saint. I actually agree with some of these beliefs, by the way. I'll let people speculate on which ones. What's really strange and notable about these guys is that even though they have some strange views, they're not at all unintelligent. Some of their work on things like Eastern Orthodoxy are top-notch. I'd even go so far as to say some of the best out there. It's just strange how one day they'll upload the best defense of the Immaculate Conception that you've ever seen, and then the next day they'll upload a video saying James White is possessed because he makes funny faces when you pause videos of him talking. But overall, I actually really like their content. I don't endorse everything they say, but honestly, I love their fortitude. The church is filled with people who constantly water things down because they don't want to make people upset. But over in this corner of the internet, we have two brothers who come right out and say, everyone without water baptism goes to hell. Don't like it? Too bad. Here are 18 saint quotes backing this up. And that's the kind of fortitude we need more of. Also, I can't talk about Sedevacantism and VaticanCatholic.com without talking about the debate that happened a few months ago. On September 20th, 2022, Peter Diamond and Jeff Kaspin debated Sedevacantism on the channel Pints with Aquinas. Even before the debate happened, the news itself of it happening shocked people. It was such a large platform to debate something that most people saw as a fringe theory. The day before the debate, I went out to dinner with a friend, and I got food poisoning. So I had to stay home that day, and I ended up seeing it live. The debate was exhilarating. No disrespect to Jeff Kaspin at all, but he was really underprepared. It turned into Peter Diamond annihilating him for 2 hours straight. You can see Kaspin get pretty nervous at times.
The faith. Is Joe Biden a member of the Catholic Church?
Well, his bishop seems to think so.
I'm asking you, do you consider him to be in your communion, one in faith with him?
Well, I
Is
don't
he
have,
in your church?
You're begging the question. I don't have the authority to declare him. Yeah, and
So
I'm
you-
answering the question.
So
You
your
don't want an
answer is
answer, you just want to interrupt me. So are
Go
we
ahead.
just going to do this where you ask a question and then you interrupt me because you don't want me to speak on it? Or what do you want to do at this point?
I'm
I
asking
gave you the
do you
respect.
consider Joe
I gave
Biden?
you the respect when I asked a question for you to answer it. Why won't you allow me to do the same? It's a simple act of charity.
Pints with Aquinas ended up apologizing for even having the debate and didn't upload it anywhere other than YouTube. To this day, the debate is missing from the usual podcast streaming apps. After this incident, I honestly don't think that any other mainstream Catholic channels will ever interact with the Diamond Brothers or VaticanCatholic.com ever again. This entry is one that doesn't have a whole lot of discussion around it. See, when Catholics say the Catechism, they're referring to a catechism that didn't exist until the 90s. This is what we call the Catechism of the Catholic Church. See, I grew up with the Baltimore Catechism, and maybe I'm just stupid, but when I got older and I heard people talking about the Catechism of the Catholic Church, or even the Catechism, I assumed they were talking about a supreme catechism above all others that the church had been using for centuries. I didn't realize they were talking about a book that was released the same year as Home Alone 2. And I'm not saying that new is always bad. Every traditional document was new at one point. But what's weird is that it only came out about 30 years ago, and it immediately took root through the entire Catholic world, and it seemed as the preeminent source for all theological discussion. This was obviously coordinated, and the higher-ups in the church obviously wanted to do a factory reset on theology. But let's get into the specifics. Why exactly is it bad? Well, for starters, let's look at the history. Cardinal Ratzinger himself said that when they tried to draft the catechism in Latin, it was a failure and it led to several miscommunications. They just decided to do French as the primary language instead, and this is what the 90s catechism was first release in. Let's break this down a little bit. The church is in such a bad shape that you guys can't even communicate together in Latin, which is the official language of the church, and your response is, Yeah, we're set to make a new catechism to be used by everyone. Oh, also, this has to be the reference point for all future catechisms. Studiet ceci. In addition, most of the passages don't really mean anything. For example, let's look at paragraph 166. Faith is a personal act, the free response of the human person to the initiative of God who reveals himself. But faith is not an isolated act. No one can believe alone, just as no one can live alone. You have not given yourself faith, as you have not given yourself life. The believer has received faith from others and should hand it on to others. Our love for Jesus and for our neighbor impels us to speak to others about our faith. Each believer is thus a link in a great chain of believers. I cannot believe without being carried by the faith of others, and by my faith, I help and support others in the faith. Okay, so what does this mean? Seriously, what the heck does this even mean? No one can believe alone? Why not? I cannot believe without being carried by the faith of others? Why is a catechism using first person in a theological explanation? Also, what does that mean? The entire book is filled with stuff like this. It just feels like nearly incoherent musings that imitate intelligence without really saying anything of substance. Or in other words, they use as many words as possible to not say anything. Even though this seems to be a pretty accessible topic, and it doesn't seem to take a whole lot of research to say the 90s catechism is bad, I put it this low on the iceberg because there really doesn't seem to be that much conversation about it among trads. Most trads just quietly ignore it. I guess because it's impossible to call it heretical if it's not saying anything. Catholics have the wrong English Glory Be prayer. This might make some people mad, but what most people call the traditional Glory Be is actually a mistranslation from heretics. The Glory Be that most people are familiar with as the traditional one goes like this: Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and never shall be, world without end. Amen. But this translation is from Thomas Cranmer, and let's break it down a little bit because his translation is a little bit loose in how it interprets things. So the Latin version is Gloria Patri, et Filio, et Spiritui Sancto, sic ut erat in principio, et nunc, et semper, et in saecula saeculorum. So we have Gloria Patri. Gloria means glory, and Patri means to the Father. It comes from the root word pater, but it's in the dative case, so it becomes Patri. And then we have et Filio et Spiritui Sancto. Et Filio means and the Son, with Son also being in the dative case, and then Spiritui Sancto means and the Holy Spirit, still in the dative case. Then we have sicut erat in principio. Sicut means as, and erat means was. Principio means beginning. So altogether, that would be most literally translated as was in the beginning. Side note, Latin doesn't have articles, so even though they don't say the word the, it's implied. Then we have et nunc, which means and now. Then et semper, which means and always. Then et in saecula saeculorum. Saecula saeculorum is a phrase which means age of ages. It's commonly understood to mean forever. So altogether, the literal English translation is glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as was in the beginning, and now, and always, and in the age of ages, or as was in the beginning, and now, and always, and forever. Perhaps a better English translation could be provided if someone wants it to flow better, but I'm just giving the most literal English translation. But you'll notice the phrase world without end is not in there. Also, world without end doesn't really mean anything in this case. It was made up by Thomas Cranmer, who basically decided to swap an idiom for another idiom that he just made up. Point being, the English Glory Be prayer that most people consider to be traditional was written by a heretic who made some strange translation choices. It's probably best that trads either just find a different translation to use or just stick to saying it in Latin. This one is a bit unique because it doesn't relate to the church directly. But as people get deeper into traditional Catholicism, there comes a point where they realize that literally all of society is controlled by the devil. It's not just the most obvious psyops that even slightly traditional-leaning people can spot. It's everything on the radio, everything on TV, every movie being made, every advertisement you see, every book published, and the structure and layout of society itself. It's all evil, and it's all being controlled by Satan. Honestly, I'm not going to expand on this one too much. Maybe I'll make a video series in the future going over it, but because of the time constraints of this video, I'll just have to say that you either see it or you don't. And if you don't see it, unplug from all pop culture, all TV, and all modern movies for a month, and then you'll start seeing it. This one might end up not being placed well. I'll mention that I'm currently writing the script on March 28th, 2023, and this is my 4th day of writing it, and I'm recording it on March 29th. It's going to take me a colossal amount of time to record this entire script, edit the audio, and then make the entire video as well. And by the time I'm done with all of that, there's a possibility that Pope Francis will have already restricted the TLM even more, pushing Quo Primum into the mainstream discussion. So if you're watching this video and you're confused about Quo Primum being this low even though everyone's talking about it, that's why. But what is Quo Primum? Basically, in the 1500s, there was a codification and solidification of what we now call the traditional Latin Mass. This codification happened at the Council of Trent, which is why it's also called the Tridentine Mass. After this was all set in place, Pope Pius V released a papal bull called Quo Primum. It made it very clear that no one was ever allowed to force a priest to say a different version of the Mass, ever. Here's an excerpt. In virtue of our apostolic authority, we grant and concede in perpetuity that, for the chanting or reading of the Mass in any church whatsoever, this missal is hereafter to be followed absolutely, without any scruple of conscience or fear of incurring any penalty, judgment, or censure, and may be freely and lawfully used. Nor are superiors, administrators, canons, chaplains, and other secular priests, or religious of whatever title designated, obligated to celebrate the Mass otherwise than as enjoined by us. We likewise declare and ordain that no one whosoever is forced or coerced to alter this missal, and that this present document cannot be revoked or modified, but remain always valid and retain its full force, notwithstanding the previous constitutions and decree of the Holy See, as well as any general or specific constitutions or edicts of provincial or synodal councils, and notwithstanding the practice and customs of the aforesaid churches, established by long and immemorial prescriptions, except, however, if more than 200 years standing. No one whosoever is permitted to alter this notice of our permission, statute, ordinance, command, precept, grant, indult, declaration, will, decreed, and prohibition. Would anyone, however, presume to commit such an act, he should know that he will incur the wrath of Almighty God and of the blessed apostles Peter and Paul. So, yeah, this is some pretty powerful stuff. It basically says that no one can force a priest to say a different Mass than the traditional Latin Mass, that this decree will be binding for all time and no one can ever revoke it, and if someone tries to revoke it, they'll call down God's wrath. Now, lots of people give silly reasons why it's totally valid for Pope Francis to ban the Latin Mass in spite of this document. Things like, a pope can't bind a future pope on discipline. There are lots of debates on whether or not this is the case, whether or not the Mass counts as a discipline, etc. But to really get to the heart of it, just think of it in these terms. One of two popes did something they didn't have the authority to do. How can we be positive that Pius V is definitely the one who was wrong, and the Vatican II popes are definitely the ones who are right? I might make a video about Quo Primum soon, because I think there are things that even trads aren't addressing in it. But I want to take my time to research it and make sure I'm actually correct about what I'm saying before I just throw it out there. This brings us to our fourth and final layer. This is stuff that's really deep, or conclusions that you'll only reach if you're really far along the traditional Catholicism pipeline. So to start out with, we have most Catholics would call the saints crazy. And what I mean by this is that if you take the opinions, stances, and preaching styles of most of the saints throughout history, modern day Catholics would say, this guy's a radical, we don't want anything to do with him. And if you don't believe me, let's go through a couple facts about the saints. St. John Vianney said that dancing came from the devil and it is absolutely evil. And no, he never made any sort of distinction between provocative dancing and non-provocative dancing. And most of the time he seemed to be talking about formal dances where young people went to socialize. He also said that if a mother lets her child above the age of 2 sleep in the same bed as her, she's committing a sin, even if it's because
forced to share a bed with your son or daughter who is an adult as well. Like, is that still counts? Like, the fuck are you talking about? Like, my man. That is stupid on the highest order.
because of cold temperatures. St. Augustine said that fictitious entertainment such as stage dramas were sinful, and St. John of the Cross said that it hindered your relationship with God when you tried to remember things. And that's not even getting into the fact that every single saint before the 1960s very clearly...
This is Doctor. This is literally George Orwell's 1984. You're not even allowed a basic cognitive abilities? That is... Like, bro. Seriously, like this is stupid.
Really said that outside the church there is no salvation. They also converted people as if unconverted people would absolutely go to hell if they weren't converted. The idea of all religions leading to heaven, or the idea of just dialoguing with people, was totally foreign to the saints, and they would have rejected it. Point is, if a saint were to resurrect and start preaching again today, nearly every single Catholic would call them a radical and say we shouldn't listen to them.
Like, seriously, like the that is like stupid as well. Like, what? Seriously, like that is like what the hell is like those rules? But I remember there was a study where people trying to analyze the Jesus psychology is mental health, you know, and many came to agreement that he was suffering some psychiatric disorder, you know, suffering some form of schizophrenia or schizothymic or dissociative identity disorder. So yeah. Oh yeah, let me. I found this. In 2012, a team of psychiatrists, behavior psychologists, neurologists, and neuropsychiatrists from Harvard Medical School published a research suggesting the development of a new diagnostic category for psychiatric disorders related to religious delusion and hyper-religiosity to compare the thoughts and behavior of most important figures in the Bible, with patients affected by the mental disorder related to psychotic spectrum using different cluster disorder diagnostic criteria or the DSM-IVTR. They concluded that these biblical figures may have been psychotic symptoms that contribute inspiration for their revelation, such as schizophrenia, psychoaffective disorder, bipolar disorder, delusional disorder, delusional grandeur, auditory visual hallucination, paranoia, and Schoolworth syndrome, especially for Paul, and abnormal expression associated with a temporal lobe epilepsy. The author hypothesized that the decision may have sought to defraud suicide by proxy. So there you go.
Tate Domino is a document released by Pope Eugene IV at the Council of Florence. It's very deep on this iceberg because it gives what is probably the strictest interpretation of extra ecclesiam nulla salus, or outside the church there is no salvation, in all of church history. It's so extreme that even a lot of traditionalists try to explain it away or reinterpret it. It states, the most holy Roman Church firmly believes, professes, and preaches that none of those existing outside the Catholic Church, not only pagans, but also Jews and heretics and schismatics, can ever be partakers of eternal life, but that they are to go into the eternal fire which was prepared for the devil and his angels, unless they are before death joined with her. And that so important is the unity of this ecclesiastical body that only those remaining within this unity can profit from the sacraments of the church unto salvation, and that they alone can receive eternal recompense for their fast, alms deeds, and other works of Christian piety and duties of a Christian soldier. No one, let his almsgiving be as great as it may, no one, even if he pour out his blood for the name of Christ, can be saved unless they abide within the bosom and unity of the Catholic Church. Wow, this is some intense stuff. And it's worth noting that this is an unofficial translation because the Vatican has never released this document in any other languages but Latin and Italian. I wonder why. But if you look up the Latin version and you put it through Google Translate, you'll see that it means the same thing. All interest is usury is a hard pill for a lot of people to swallow. See, most people think that usury is interest at an excessive rate or some type of unreasonable interest. But this is not true. Here's the definition of usury according to the 1600s theologian von Espin. Usury is defined as the actual or expected profit from a loan. I'm sorry, there's no wiggle room there. All interest is usury. Plus, the separation of usury and interest into two different concepts, one being good and the other being bad, is a distinction that comes from Calvin. So if people want to say that interest is fine as long as it's not usury, they're adopting a Calvinist mindset and completely turning their back on the traditional teaching in order to make their claims.
This is what Paul said, being said that women are not allowed to speak at the church.
So basically, women aren't allowed to speak in churches. This is actually a biblical teaching. It comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verses 34 and 35. Let women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted for them to speak, but to be subject, as also the law saith. But if they would learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is a shame for a woman to speak in the church. Now, of course, there are lots of people who try to explain this away so that let women keep silence in churches does not actually mean let women keep silence in churches, but basically this just boils down to them throwing out phrases like cultural context in an attempt to add nuance without substance. Oh gosh, this is getting so fun. So this is going to require a bit of background explanation for those who might not be aware. Firstly, let's address Feeneyism. I'll go ahead and use this clip of a priest explaining it.
This is a priest named Father Feeney out of the Boston area. And you could see there the bishop silenced him. He was actually excommunicated because he taught you must be a physically registered member of the Catholic Church in order to be saved. The church condemned that. It became a big issue in the 1940s and 1950s. He ended up being excommunicated, although I think he did get reconciled before he died. But that means the church made it clear that non-Catholics can get to heaven.
It's also worth mentioning that Father Feeney did not believe in baptism of blood or desire. But even within traditional communities, even sedevacantists, the explanation Father Chris Alar gives seems to be the common explanation. Father Feeney was a heretic, he was condemned by the church in the 50s, therefore Feeneyism is a heresy. But there's actually a lot more to this story. Firstly, Father Feeney was not excommunicated because of heresy. He was excommunicated because he was summoned to Rome to answer for undisclosed charges. He requested that they tell him his charges before he arrived in Rome, because Canon 1723 says that he has a right to be told his charges ahead of time. The Vatican refused this request. He appealed to Pope Pius XII directly, and the Pope ignored him. So, Father Feeney didn't comply. He didn't show up because he was never told his charges, which he had a right to know. And the Vatican didn't like this, so eventually...
I'm going to agree 100%. That's kind of fucked up. Like, he doesn't know what crime is, so he wants to know, what did I do wrong? And they don't respond. It's like, I'm not gonna go there. That sounds like a trap. So
they excommunicated him for disobedience, not for heresy. And to give a personal opinion real quick, that excommunication seems totally bogus to me. They demanded he go to Rome to defend himself against charges. They refused to tell him what the charges were, so he had literally no time to prepare a defense, and then they excommunicated him for being disobedient when he didn't show up. That's bogus. Well, anyways, after his excommunication, the Holy See wrote a document about Father Fini's interpretation of Extra Ecclesiam Nulla Salus. But this document was never actually officially signed by the Pope. I won't get too deep into the specifics on this point, but if you want to learn more, Peter Diamond actually has a pretty good video doing a deep dive into this. Another part of the story that no one seems to bring up is that the Vatican actually lifted his excommunication, and Father Fini never had to retract his statements in any way for the excommunication to be lifted. So let's break down the data.
Sorry, I got interrupted.
Father Fini was excommunicated for disobedience for a bogus reason. The excommunication was lifted without him having to recant, and the Vatican released criticism of him in a document in a fallible source that was never signed by the Pope. I'm gonna be honest, guys. I really don't think there's much reason to say Finiism is a condemned heresy. And while we're on the topic of Father Fini, I just want to give some quick side notes about him. The dude sounds like a Giga Chad. His Wikipedia page tells of 2 separate accounts of people deciding to challenge him publicly on his ideas, approaching him, and then leaving shortly after in a rage. And one of these 2 people is Robert F. Kennedy, the brother of John F. Kennedy. Just imagine this playing out in real life. They're obviously saving face because they must have gotten whipped by Father Fini. All this to say, there's much more to Finiism than people say. Finiism is not a condemned heresy, and Father Fini was actually a little bit of a Chad. Although, I do have to say that I do disagree with him on some of the things he said, but I think he was honestly way closer to the truth than modern theologians who say everyone can be saved in their own religion. In 1966, a priest named Father Malachi Martin released a novel called Windswept House. Now, Father Malachi Martin isn't just a random nobody. He worked in the Vatican and was even a professor at the Pontifical Biblical Institute. And in his book, he tells the story of a satanic ritual performed in the Vatican for the enthronement of Lucifer. And this enthronement apparently happened in 1963. Now, the book is fiction. Kind of. It's supposed to be a faction novel or a fictitious account of
that
real
sounds
events.
like a
The names are slightly
fiction.
changed and there are other
Like
small
that's
things
just
like
a
that.
conspiracy
The
theory.
story is supposedly true. This is a pretty niche topic that doesn't get talked about a lot. There's a lot more that can be said about this, but to address any other aspect of this, it would take way too much time for just this iceberg, so I highly recommend you research this more on your own. As our final entry, we have one of the hardest pills for Catholics to swallow. Most people go to hell. This is
Therefore, God does not deserve to be worshipped. There is, again, hell is evil by default. God should not allow hell to exist. No amount of finite crime justify infinite punishment. Never. Absolutely zero. Full stop. God is evil.
This is a fact. Jesus himself says this in Luke chapter 13 verses 22 through 24. And Jesus went through the cities and towns teaching and making his journey to Jerusalem. And a certain man said to him, Lord, are there few that are saved? But he said to them, Strive to enter by the narrow gate, for many, I say to you, shall seek to enter and shall not be able. And there's also Matthew chapter 7 verses 13 and 14. Enter ye in at the narrow gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leadeth to destruction. And there are many who go in thereat. How narrow is the gate, and strait is the way that leadeth to life, and few there are that find it. As related by Saint Vincent Ferrer, there was once an archdeacon who died at the same hour as Saint Bernard. He appeared to his bishop after his death and said, Know, Monsignor, that at the